You really become a real Christian when you continually have a whiff of your own cesspool. The other one is called blind spots. And blind spots are different from weak spots because many times we know what our weak spots are. But our blind spots, many times we are oblivious to them until we actually find ourselves on the garbage heap, or we actually find ourselves at a point of ruin or a point of injury in our life. And whenever you think of a blind spot, a lot of times you're thinking about driving. You know, in driving, there's always a blind spot. If you're going for your license and they're teaching you how to drive, they say you have to check your blind spot. There's a spot that is to your side where there might be a car where you don't know where it is. Actually, in the medical world, apparently I have found that every person has a blind spot, a spot in your retina that is just kind of this, I guess it's about the size of a pencil eraser. And it is a spot that every single person, every single one, you have a physical blind spot. And so you say, well, I don't notice that when I'm looking around. I don't see any kind of blind spot. Well, what happens is that our brain kind of creates the image and fills in the gap. And so you don't actually see it. Your brain has kind of covered it up. Well, you know what? The same thing happens spiritually as well. That somehow, in some way, we kind of want to maintain this kind of level of spirituality, and so instead of actually exposing this junk, we kind of hide it. We kind of find a way where we spiritually justify it, or we somehow hide it, and all of a sudden we don't even realize that it is there. And so with a blind spot, and Job says this in Job 31, verse 33, as he's going through all the difficult things that he's going through, he says, could it be that I have somehow hidden sin in my bosom? In other words, is it perhaps one of those things where I might be blind to something while making it clear that I can see it in other people's? And that's kind of the funny thing about a blind spot, because I have a real easy time seeing it in other people. We all have an easy time seeing other people's blind spots. That's why Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, he says, listen, don't be looking at the speck in the other guy's eye when there's a great big beam, there's a great big log in your own eye. You know, Jesus always talked about that stuff. He talked about the blind leading the blind. The scariest passage, one of the scariest things that Jesus ever said was in Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, where he says, you're going to come before God and you say, hey, I prophesied in your name. I did miracles and we saw these wonderful things happen. And God says, listen, depart from me. I never even knew who you were. That there's blind spots. That there's 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5 that says this. He says, examine yourself to see whether you are in the faith. What does he mean by that? Well, he means you need to continually be looking for the blind spots. Those spots where you're susceptible, yes, but also those spots where you have just kind of really covered it up. And James says it this way. James, in James 1:21, says, be doers of the word, not hearers only. Then he says this, deceiving your own selves. Because we have a real easy way to deceive ourselves. Jesus' biggest battle were with a bunch of religious people who had deceived themselves. They had become blind to the reality of their spiritual condition. So that kind of causes us to be aware. How exactly do we become spiritually blind? Well, what happens is we misplace values. What happens is we fashion the values according to the things that we like, or the things that are most comfortable in our life. This is what I think is most comfortable, so I will kind of set things in order according to what is most convenient in my life. And so from there, what we do is we switch the price tags. Things which are important before God, we put a small price tag on. And things that aren't so important to God, we put a big price tag on. And so what happens is eventually we don't become fully obedient, we become half obedient. And in that process, what happens is we think that we are doing this wonderful thing when in fact we have kind of positioned things in a way where all of a sudden we're not really serving God the way that we should. We become blind. Man, we become blinded by so many things. We become blinded by selfishness. We become blinded by denial. We get blinded by bitterness, unforgiveness. We kind of tuck that unforgiveness away, and we figure we can just live this wonderful godly life. Yet at the same time, we're harboring all this stuff against other stuff, and it's a poison, and it's a cancer, and it's eating away at us. But yet at the same time, you just take a look at us, and things are wonderful. We see it all the time in church, don't we? Kind of come with this wonderful smile. We got the clothes. A lot of times we have had an ongoing argument from the time that we have left home, from the time that we have gotten to church. And then as soon as we get onto that church ground, we're just so wonderful. And everything is great. And our kids are well dressed and everything's in the right place. And yet at the same time, there's all this stuff that is there that we don't want to show anybody. Or stuff that is there and we're not too sure. Hey, sometimes it's unforgiveness. Sometimes it's detachment. Sometimes it is that thing that says, I don't really need to be with anybody else. My relationship with God is a personal one. And so therefore, I don't need to come to church. I don't need to be part of a body. I don't need to be able to use my gifts or anything like that. Detachment is a blind spot. Sometimes it's just that Pharisaical attitude. All of a sudden, we kind of developed this level of spirituality that we have become comfortable with, and those things that used to be bad aren't as bad in our lives. And so we become to say, you know what, God, you must really be pleased. You must really be happy with the way I'm living right now. And so this Pharisaical attitude begins to come in, and we become blind to the fact that we're wretched and we're poor and we're still that same sinner that we were. We're just forgiven by the blood of Christ. But there's still all those things. There's still, you really become a real Christian when you continually have a whiff of your own cesspool. Those blind areas. Allow God to expose them. All those things that are there, we kind of go merrily along, and all of a sudden we hit rock bottom. We're saying, what am I doing here at rock bottom? You ever wondered why sometimes you crash and burn? Sometimes I wonder why we crash and burn in our spiritual lives or just in our own lives. And sometimes I think it is just an act of love that God has to expose our blind spots. For us to take that reset button and say, okay, God, no, it's about serving you. It's about making you number one in our lives. The blind spot. It's an important thing to understand. God, is the person, the words that I'm saying equal to the heart that I have? The blind spot.